week I preached on a passage about people being able to have faith for one another, or able to support one another's faith, or encourage one another's faith in various ways. I want to follow up with that this week, and I think I need to tell more stories, because sometimes these things I get out of Scripture, when I preach about them, I talk about them and they may seem a little abstract. And I don't want them to do that. I want them to sound like the things that make up our lives. And what makes up our lives are the stories of what's happening to us and what we're doing and how we're interacting with other people. The scripture this morning comes from the 9th chapter of the Gospel according to Mark. Starting in the 17th verse. Jesus has just come down from here and there and joined a crowd that's gathered around his disciples. And someone from the crowd called out to him, "Teacher, I brought you my son. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak. And whenever it seizes him, it dashes him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And I asked your disciples to cast it out, but they could not do so." Jesus answered them, "You faithless generation, how much longer must I be among you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. It has often cast him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you are able to do anything, have pity on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you are able, all things can be done for the one who believes." And immediately the father of the child cried out, "I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You spirit that keeps this boy from speaking and hearing, I command you, come out of him, and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he was able to stand. This is the word of the Lord. I just want to dispose of a small matter because it's not the center of what I want to talk about. The demon possession in this case sounds a lot like what we now recognize as epilepsy. And probably it was as a physical disease. But demons or minions of Satan, or rather the power that opposes God and tries to twist good things and make them evil, takes advantage of things like physical sicknesses to make them into spiritual sicknesses as well. This is why last week the man was paralyzed. The man was also paralyzed in his heart and his thoughts and his feelings, in part by the oppressive force of evil, taking advantage of the paralysis of his body to try to beat down his heart. This is why Jesus started with, "Your sins are forgiven." So, I don't want us to misunderstand. There almost certainly was a physical illness behind this demon possession story, and I don't want us to misunderstand in the other direction. The physical illness doesn't answer all the questions about what was happening, what was going on, and why it affected this boy the way it did. What I want to focus on, though, and dovetail with what we talked about last week, is this business of the Father. Because Jesus says, look, all things can be done for the ones who believe. And partly he was rebuking his disciples in that. Because remember, his disciples had not been able to help with this. And earlier in his ministry, Jesus had tried to give his disciples some understanding how they too could go out and free people from demons and preach the word and even do some healing, and he'd sent them out to do some of it. So the disciples do have some experience casting out demons, that is, putting away from people the evil powers that oppress them. But here they weren't able to. They weren't able to help this man, they weren't able to help his son, and Jesus is a little bit irritated at them. They should have been able to do this. They will be able to do this in the course of time, but they haven't been able to do it yet. And it is so poignant, so affecting, when Jesus says, anything can be done for those who believe, and the Father said, I believe. And then he had to admit that he didn't really. He said, but help my unbelief. Help my unbelief. Of course I believe, because I'm here. I wouldn't be here if I didn't at least believe enough to take a chance, to hope that something would help. My son's been suffering for almost a dozen years now. Sometimes he's almost died. Yeah, I know I don't really believe. Maybe I don't really believe deeply. Maybe I'm not sure and I'm just trying you out because I'm desperate, but I believe enough to be here and try, even though I'm desperate. But help me with my unbelief. I think that God does this. Helps us out when we don't really believe. Helps us to believe stronger and better. Gives us stories that will remind us and help us as the years go by. About, oh goodness, must have been 14, 15 years ago now, I was pastoring a church over that way, about 25 miles. And some of you may remember in the first 4 or 5 years of the 2000s, we had drought conditions in New Jersey, 2 years in a row. Unusual for us. Mind you, a drought in New Jersey is 25 inches of rain a year instead of 45, but it's still a drought because farmers in New Jersey don't use irrigation. So if it doesn't rain, they are in trouble. And the church that I used to minister was a church full of people who either were farmers or used to be farmers or whose families had been farmers. So drought was no small thing to them. So we prayed all the previous summer for rain from time to time, and now with the second year in a row where it was not very rainy during the growing season, we'd been praying for rain automatically every week as part of the pastoral prayer. So on this Sunday, because it hadn't rained, and it kept not raining, I thought I'd better be more serious. So in the pastoral prayer, I prayed that it would not just rain, but that it would rain twice this week. That it would rain twice this week. And not just a sprinkle, but a real pouring down rain. And that next week, it rained twice. And both times, a serious rain. Enough to soak into the ground, not just make the grass wet. And I accepted that from God as a rebuke for me. Because when I prayed that it would rain twice in the pastoral prayer, I was pretending. I was being pastoral. I was saying something that I thought ought to be said, when in fact I've been praying for rain every week for the last 8 weeks before that, and figured that rain would come when God was good and ready. And in the meantime, it was just a matter of faithfulness for us to remember and keep praying. And so it was sort of show-offy and silly, and just a matter of trying to be dutiful when I prayed that it would rain twice. I prayed that it would rain twice. And when it rained twice, that meant God was rebuking me for not having had enough faith. And also encouraging my faith, because it did rain. And God was reminding me, whether I liked it or not, that my prayers made a difference. And that I ought to be praying about this stuff and expecting that God was going to answer our prayers. Maybe not all of them all of the time. And I've preached other sermons about those times when God's answer is no. But sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the yes is arranged in such a way as to encourage our faith. to help our unbelief. As I said last week, sometimes we encourage one another's faith. This happened to a couple I knew when I was in college. Couples at college are interesting. Sometimes they end up getting married after they graduate, sometimes not. But the relationship they have is always just a little bit delicate. You know, is this a relationship that's going to last after college? Or is this going to be my college romance and later I'll meet whoever I marry? There's a delicacy there. It makes those relationships just a tiny bit fragile sometimes. So the girl in this relationship, I'm going to call her Mary, was a biology major. And at this college that I was at, is a small college, about 1,200 students. Every senior had to write a thesis. Mostly undergraduates don't have to write a thesis. You don't have to write a thesis until you're getting a master's degree or until you do a dissertation for a doctor's degree. But this college had the requirement that everyone write a senior thesis, one class for a whole year. In effect, an essay or a paper approximately the length of a small book. And she was doing an essay in biology, and it was an essay on the different theories about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. And I didn't know what that was until I asked someone to explain it to me, and it doesn't matter much for this story either. What matters for this story is that it was a library thesis, not a research thesis, not a laboratory thesis. She didn't go into the lab and do work. She didn't do experiments and write up the results. She didn't even go out into the field and observe animals where they were living. It was all a library thesis. Read up what different biologists have said about these two different theories about how cells were formed and make the best judgments you can based on it. And she was a little bit ashamed of herself because she felt like a real biologist does the laboratory work or goes out into the field and does field work. And doing a library thesis was an admission that she wasn't very good. And she got worked up about it and was afraid. Mind you, this is a Christian girl, Roman Catholic, but Christian. But getting no comfort from her faith about this, because she was certain that she was failing. Not quite failing. She didn't think she was going to get an F in the course, but a course like that that's so important, that's in your own field, a C is as bad as an F in your own field and the important courses at the end. And it was beginning to mess her up. And she was losing sleep and not eating well and having a hard time working. Because when you sit down to read or to write on a piece of work that you're convinced isn't good enough, it's almost impossible to get started. Every day you sit down and you feel like, I can't do this because it's not good enough, and you sit there and you don't get things done. Not everybody reacts that way, but a lot of people do. And her boyfriend, a boy named David, saw all this happening to her and tried to comfort her and tried to support her and tried to be, you know, encouraging and supportive and confident and you know, I believe in you and this is all right and you've done a lot of good stuff. And it wasn't helping any at all. Sometimes that kind of thing doesn't. And he realized that her faith in herself, in her ability to do the work, in her ability to do what she'd set herself as a task, needed some encouragement that he couldn't figure out how to give her. And he took a chance, and it was a terrible chance, because as I say, college romances can be a little bit brittle. He took a chance, and he went to her advisor, the professor who was advising her thesis. And he explained to the professor, fortunately the professor in this case was a woman, so he was saved a certain discomfort of talking to a man about someone's emotional difficulties with doing a bit of schoolwork. He talked to her professor, her advisor, about the difficulties she was having. Just a short explanation, but short and honest and clear. and made it apparent that unless she received some encouragement, she was not going to be able to get this work done. And David told me afterwards, he even said to the professor, look, maybe she's right. I don't know. This isn't my field. You know. But if you know her work and you know she's doing good work, it would help if you told her that, because she's having a hard time believing it right now. And the professor said she's doing great work. She's doing wonderful work. She shouldn't feel like this about a library thesis, because she's doing a really good library thesis, which is a lot better than a half-assed laboratory thesis. The professor said, I'll talk to her. And the professor did talk to her, and it worked out great. It broke the back of her doubts, her self-doubts, and enabled her to get back to work and finish up. And it also worked out all right in the sense that David had been afraid that going to her professor and talking to her professor about her and her having difficulties could blow their relationship too. And it could have. It could have. Sometimes people resent that. It didn't in this case. I don't know what happened to them after college. I got no idea if they got married or not. But at least this didn't break their relationship. She needed encouragement, and she needed her faith restored and uplifted. And sometimes it takes the right person to do that. I had a friend years ago named Ellen Hurwitz. Ellen was great at praying for things when she needed them, because Ellen was sort of kind of poor. I say sort of kind of because she wasn't really poor by any standards in the world, because she had enough money to be going to college. And college in those days was a lot of money. It was costing her $5,500 a year to go to the college we were at. That was $5,500 a year in 1970. So that's about the equivalent of $40,000 or $50,000 a year now, of the changes in college prices. So she had money. She really did. Her family had money, just not a lot to spare for fun living while she was at college. And she was short of money for clothes and other things. And so she used to save money by not buying clothes in stores, but in Goodwill stores or getting them from friends. And she would pray for stuff all the time. I remember one time she said, I need a new pair of shoes. I've been praying for new shoes for 3 days now. And it's like, okay, Ellen, I hope that, you find new shoes sometime soon. And we went to church that day. Most of my fellowship at college used to go to a Quaker church. And someone walked up to Terry. Terry was one of the leaders of our group, and said, hey, I got a bunch of shoes I need to give away, and I'm going to take them to Goodwill tomorrow if nobody needs them. But does anyone, on the college fellowship need shoes? And sure enough, there was a pair in there. There were 2 pair in there. One a pair of soft tennis shoes, and one a pair of actually dress shoes that were exactly the right size for Ellen, and boom, there she had shoes again. Now I remember about the shoes, but I also remember that Ellen did this all the time. Something like this happened to Ellen at least 6 times a school year, where she would pray for something and boom, it would appear. And Joe Bodner, Joe's the minister over at Bayard Street Church. It used to be when we were meeting at Livingston Street, I could have pointed and said 4 blocks that way, but we're not there anymore, so now it's 12 miles that way. But Joe's a minister at Bayard Street Presbyterian Church, and that church is in the middle of a pretty poor chunk of New Brunswick. And they do a lot of different stuff there. They rent the sanctuary out to 5 or 6 different other worshiping congregations, and they have a food pantry on Saturdays. Once a month at first, and now slightly more often. And when they at first had it, here they are for poor people holding this food pantry on Saturday so people can come and get food. And 6 people would show up, sometimes 10, sometimes just 4. Joe couldn't figure out why people weren't coming, because he knew there were needs out there. And he knew that he had people who were ready to try to supply those needs. So he went out one time and he said, okay, he said, I'm going to pay people to come in. And he put out the word in the neighborhood that he was going to give $5, a $5 bill to everyone who came to the food pantry the next Saturday to get food. And 20 or 30 people showed up. And Joe handed out $5 bills. They were coming out of his personal pocket at that time. And the next month, he did it again. And 25 or 30 people showed up. And the next month, he did it again. And 50 or 60 people showed up. And someone also came up to him and said, Joe, where are you getting the $5 bills you're handing out? And Joe said, out of my pocket. And he said, here. He said, here's a check for $200 for the church to help supply these $5 bills you're giving out. And Joe, soon after that, was able to stop handing out $5 bills because people were coming now. And people were giving more stuff to the food pantry. And the food pantry was having more food than food pantries usually have, and people started giving furniture and clothes as well. So they found a place to stick the furniture and clothes down in the basement so that people could get them. And Joe, who'd been wondering, Joe's been at that church for 42 years. Pardon me, he's been the minister of that church for 42 years. He was born in that church, baptized there. He was confirmed there when he was growing up. Came back to it after seminary and is the only church he's ever served. Joe, who'd been sitting there and for 10 years been thinking, how are we going to do something for the poor people in New Brunswick? What can we do for the poor people in New Brunswick? Is there anything we can do other than let people use the sanctuary here for their own congregational meetings? Why aren't people coming to our food pantry Saturday? And then he started giving away money, and gee whiz, it's no surprise that people came when he started giving money. The surprise and the encouragement to his faith was that now people started giving to the food pantry. Now people started giving money to the church for the church to give away to people. And even though Joe stopped handing out $5 bills, he still was giving money away when the occasion seemed appropriate. Paying people's utility bills from time to time. He said to me, he said, one time I had a guy come in, his utility bill was overdue, they were threatening to turn it off. The minimum he could pay in order to get them to not turn it off was $180, and in fact he already owed them something like $320. And Joe said, okay, we'll deal with that. You've got the bill? Good. We'll write out the check. And he wrote out a check out of his own personal bank account to give to PSE&G. You do be careful. You make the check out to PSE&G, not the person who's talking to you. And while he was talking to this person, having just finished the check, and before they left, his phone rang. He said, just a minute. He picked up the phone, and it was someone saying, hey, Joe, listen, I'm going to give you $500 for the work your church is doing with the poor people. Again, God does these things, little things, to encourage our faith and to help us know that even the little bit of faith we've got is enough if we take a chance on it and keep taking those chances and seeing what happens. I knew a fellow named Chris about 10 years ago. Chris is an alcoholic. Used to drink an amazing lot. And he would go to Alcoholics Anonymous too. And from time to time he would get 9 or 10 months sober together, once 2 or 3 years. But he'd always go off drinking again. I got a call from him once asking me to come help, so I got another member of my congregation to go with me, and we went and picked him up where he was sitting in the parking lot of a bar and took him to a hospital because he wanted to check into a rehab. Chris was pretty seriously drunk. At the hospital they checked his blood alcohol level. It was 0.42, 4 times the legal limit. Chris couldn't have been conscious with that much alcohol in his system except for the fact that he was a trained athlete, a triathlete. Anyone else would have been unconscious by now. And I remember sitting there with Chris in the waiting room, and he was saying that free will was the worst and the nastiest and the most wicked thing that God ever did. Because if God hadn't given him free will, he wouldn't have gotten into this trouble. He wouldn't have kept screwing his life up. And he would have been perfectly happy if God had created human beings as a bunch of automatons, whom God had pre-programmed to do good and be good only, but that giving him free will, at least giving him free will, was just really a nasty, dirty trick on the part of God. On the other hand, Chris, too, had a little bit of faith. Had a little bit of faith. He called for help. I was there in the hospital waiting room with him because he called me on the phone. He was checking into rehab, again, for the 4th time in the last 10 years. He was trying it once more, accepting once more that the whole pattern of Alcoholics Anonymous is, okay, you don't have any power over this. You got to give up. You got to ask God to help you with the drinking. But yeah, you still have free will, and you got to learn how to live the rest of your life. And you got to find the faith that's necessary to live the rest of your life. So, Chris got back into Alcoholics Anonymous again. I only saw him on and off for the next 8 or 9 months, but he stayed sober then. I heard from him a while back, 2 or 3 years ago, and at that time he had 6 or 7 years sober. First time he'd ever gotten more than a year or 2. A little bit of faith, but it requires some support and some encouragement from other people, like I said last time. Sometimes God works a bit of a miracle. Everything God does is some kind of miracle. Most often, he supports our faith through other people. So I wanted to add to the theoretical ideas with some stories that would help us see what this feels like and looks like in our lives. Amen.
Stand for the song response.